As you can see, this is the work of Sophia Patain, a rather large concept, everything you need to know about threats to Minnesota waters and we're afraid to ask. So I'm going to talk pretty rapidly and hopefully I will be able to get through all of our slides and then there'll be time for questions. And let's just see, did I miss a slide? Today's outline. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about WaterLegacy, just in case not everybody knows. And then I'm going to talk about the concept of regulatory capture, which is, I think, one of the most important things for people to understand is that in general, Minnesota government agencies that are supposed to be protecting environment are not doing so. And then I'm going to talk about some of the pollution from agriculture and industry. And then I'm going to focus on copper nickel mining, both because it's a very important threat for our waters, especially in northern Minnesota, and it's because it's a really good example of how the system really works behind the scenes. And in this, I'm going to explain sort of how WaterLegacy has been effective in protecting water and what are some of the additional steps or challenges ahead, and then sort of end on what do we value and how can members of the community help participate in making sure that our government and our state reflects our values. And this picture is one that I took of the St. Louis River, which is downstream of the proposed PolyMet mine. And this is a picture of Lake Superior. And then just a summary, Christina already mentioned WaterLegacy's mission to protect Minnesota's fresh waters and the communities that rely on them. 10% of the world's fresh water is in Lake Superior itself. And that is a very important resource, not only for us, but for generations in the future. WaterLegacy's story, we were formed by citizens who are concerned about the toxic new PolyMet mine. And we expanded our strategies and programs as we learned the scope of the threats to Minnesota waters and where the gaps were in our laws and in our enforcement so that we weren't doing a good enough job protecting those waters. Now, here's a little bit about how we work. We work a lot using science and law and taking the hard cases that will make a difference in protecting water and habitats and communities. We've also done our work from the beginning in partnership and in solidarity with tribes, consulting with tribes before we adopt our strategies and sharing our resources and our experts. And also there's a big part of our work, which is education and organizing, which is helping people to strengthen their knowledge and capacity for action. And many of our experts have been citizen experts, people in the community who have learned how to be advocates and already knew the science or knew the technology. And we measure our success in terms of legal and advocacy outcomes, our permits being denied or revised, our water quality standards being supported and enforced. We also look at, are we building capacity so that not only our organization, but our partners will have more resources and knowledge to protect water quality and human beings and the natural communities that also rely on life-giving water. And one of our goals, and you can see this was an event that we did with Honor of the Earth in Duluth, you can see the bridge in the background, is to work on growing a movement so that it's sort of a movement to restore the sense of how we work as a civic community in responsibility to each other and in responsibility to maintain the nature that we rely on for our life, not just for now, but for generations of grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. So you can see that my husband thought this was a very odd picture of a snowplow, but I'm going to explain why it's there. It's because one of our priorities is to focus on the PolyMet sulfide mine. And PolyMet is Minnesota's first Minnesota copper nickel sulfide mine, the first one ever. And they told their own investors that PolyMet would serve like a snowplow and all the other mines would follow. And that includes mines that are up close to the boundary waters. And also, I'm going to talk a little bit about a proposed sulfide mine that is in the Mississippi River watershed. So the pollution would affect literally millions of people in Minnesota downstream. And this picture here, you might have seen in the news people talking about how PolyMet's their tailings dump would be located on a brownfield site. But this is where their mine would be located. And these are pristine forested wetlands. And you can see this is the Partridge River, this sinuous river. This is a very high quality area for biodiversity, and it's in the headwaters of the St. Louis River. So it's anything but a sacrifice zone. Now, as we did our work, we discovered that in order to accommodate toxic projects, whether it's the PolyMet mine or industrial projects, our state continually rolls back standards and rolls back rules that would protect the environment. So our mission and expanded to include preserving and enforcing state water quality standards. And finally, it is exhausting and very conflict oriented to keep trying to appeal or litigate and solve problems. It feels like we're playing whack-a-mole with one bad project after another. And so our long-term goal has to be to build a movement that will protect environment and justice and health, basically to protect people, not polluters, and make sure that our regulatory agencies see the community as their customers, and not just the people who or the foreign corporations that are seeking permits. Now, I want to be really clear that when I'm talking today about something being wrong with our agency, I'm not talking about direct corruption. None of my work I have seen what is called a quid pro quo, where someone takes a bribe. What I'm talking about, and I think is a problem in Minnesota, is regulatory capture. And that's defined in Investopedia by saying an agency charged with acting in the public interest instead acts in ways that benefit the industry it is supposed to be regulating. And from our perspective, this is not an individual decision of employees or scientists in the agencies. This is a system that we have allowed the politicians and their lobbyists to create. And this cartoon is an example, because I've been doing this work in Minnesota for 40 years, and I keep seeing that the agencies are continually under the threat of a shutdown or a disapproval or a commissioner not being approved. And what it does is it means that the workers are always feeling the hot breath of complying with the powerful on their necks every time they make a decision. So as we talk throughout the next number of slides about what's actually happening in specific cases, I want us to keep in mind, who are the customers of the agency, or at least who are they acting like they are the customers of the agency, and who are we relying on to protect the rights of people, nature, rather than the rights of polluters. So, did I miss a slide here? Yes, I did. Many of us are old enough to remember this beautiful Time magazine cover with Governor Wendell Anderson and the fish in the clear water, The Good Life in Minnesota. The 70s were the heyday of environmental protection. That's when many of the laws, the water quality standards that still are maintained and have not been rolled back, they were adopted in the 1970s. The environmental review legislation, that was adopted in the 1970s. And since the 1970s, what I've seen, and this is now a matter of decades, so it's accelerated in the last few years, as the legislature and the agencies have rolled back the much more rigorous environmental protection that we had in the 1970s, or have simply not responded adequately to new threats since that time. You know, the obvious one is that the legislature has put a lot of pressure on the agencies to issue permits quickly. And what that means is if the agencies have reservations or would like to tell the industry, listen, you have to go back and study it again, this is not protective enough, they're very much constrained. And they're even required to report to the legislature if they don't meet those deadlines. So you can see from the politicians coming down to the managers, coming down to the employees, the pressure not to take the science seriously and find scientific solutions. And when there are rules, and I've been involved now in several rulemaking examples, when there are rules being formulated by the agencies, and Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is doing this relatively often, the rules say that you have one after another criteria about analyzing costs to the polluters. And there's no similar balance about all the details analyzing costs to the environment or to human health. So the system is beginning to put its finger on the scale even before a rule is proposed. Now, a very concrete example, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency used to have a citizen board. And there were some representatives who were agency people. And then I remember Dr. Foley was on that board for many years out of Ramsey County Medical, and he's a very knowledgeable person. And there were just basic ordinary citizens who were able to weigh in on permitting decisions. Well, after that citizens board ordered an environmental review for a dairy feedlot, the legislature came in and wiped it out. And right now there is no citizen review of any MPCA decisions, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency decisions, unless somehow you get a court, and that's the only level of review. And I'm not sure how if everybody tracked this, that earlier this year, a Minnesota Pollution Control Agency Commissioner Bishop resigned. And that was because she was promised a confirmation fight in the Senate long after she was appointed. And the Senate held that confirmation fight as a sort of Damocles over her head. And the issue was the very first baby steps that Governor Walz wanted to take for clean cars, not to require them, but simply to require that dealers have them available so that if you or I want to buy an electric vehicle, we could do that. And that tiny baby step was enough for the Senate to say, we're not going to confirm your commissioner. And so she resigned. And so one of the things we need to keep in mind is that the pressure to do a job either too quickly without considering the science or without considering the environment is coming from the politics. And that means a countervailing pressure has to come from us. Now, how do we see this actually being played out? Mining is not the first industry to affect water quality. And one of the important things is that industrial agriculture has a long history in Minnesota of uncontrolled runoff, which is sediments, and excessive fertilizer. I did some work for an organic farm to keep a pipeline off the farm and learned that industrial agriculture, they put the fertilizer on in November. They don't have a cover crop with a corn or a soybean, and is bare earth, and they put the excessive fertilizer on in November, and most of it washes off in the spring. And even efforts to, sort of make voluntary changes with buffers or with cover crops have been very intensely resisted. And so as a result of this, you can see this picture from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency website. So it's a little fuzzy, of the sediment coming in from the Minnesota River, how brown it is when it meets the Mississippi. And another result is that through much of Minnesota, rural Minnesota, nitrates from fertilizer have permeated the aquifers at rates that would cause a risk of actual death of children, infants, and that's 10 parts per million. And right now there is no water quality standard that says this is a limit on nitrates in surface water, which is the way to control this. And instead, there are all kinds of complicated laws for best management practices. And one of the things that WaterLegacy did in 2021 is we did a petition, and hundreds of community members signed it, asking the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to put in place a standard for nitrate for class 2, namely surface waters. They had done the science on the need for the standard in 2010, and that draft technical report had simply been dropped. And we found that in their files and said it's time to go back. And it looks like they may be considering that effort, because that is a really important tool in order to prevent a very serious health impact of nitrate in drinking water. And then also, if you've ever heard of the dead zone in the Gulf, which is lack of oxygen, that's because of excessive nutrients. And it starts up here with us. And the excessive nutrients result in huge amounts of algae and reduce the oxygen in the water. And so if you look on the Environmental Protection Agency map, or basically just anywhere, you can see that there's a huge area of the Gulf zone where Our lack of, I guess, stringency and rigor in Minnesota is creating a problem that is far beyond our borders. And here's where it might impact our borders. This is actually from Don Arnosti's collection of slides. He knows more about this than I do. That in 2016, in the Whitewater River, there was a huge fish kill. And the Departments of Agriculture and Health and Natural Resources did a study, and they concluded they were unable to pinpoint causes of fish kill. Now, Jeff Broberg, who's an environmental consultant and works also with well owners, he said, listen, if they can't find the cause, then it's the general conditions. That's what killed the fish, the normal farming practices. And that's whether it's pesticides or excessive fertilizer, there's something we're doing wrong in a huge swath of the southern part of our state. Now, I think this is another thing you've probably read about in the news. The acronym is PFAS, and it's a complicated, it's a range of persistent manufactured chemicals. And in the East Metro, in the Twin Cities, 14 communities' drinking water is contaminated with PFAS. And this is the non-stick coating chemicals that 3M and other companies have made, and they're known to cause liver damage, kidney and testicular cancer, and effects on the thyroid and hormone disruption. And we know that the 3M company dumped PFAS in Minnesota landfills, but actually PFAS have been found in the water, soil, and fish across the state. So there are lots of other sources. And the Attorney General sued 3M and got an $850 million settlement, which is a start. But it's not actually practical once you've dumped a toxic chemical, a persistent toxic chemical in groundwater. You can't get it all out. And that's something we have to keep in mind, that yes, there might be a settlement, yes, there might be a lawsuit, but it will never restore the quality of groundwater and make it safe. And I want to point this out, that just as we said, there is no water quality standard for nitrate in the surface water, there are no enforceable drinking water quality standards for PFAS. Now, the health department has done a non-binding health risk limit. Namely, they've done the science and they said this stuff is super dangerous and it should be limited. But the way our rules are set up now, there is no enforceable drinking water quality standards where the industry could be told right up front, you can't put this in any way that is going to go into drinking water. And that same issue is important for mining, because many of the chemicals that are toxic that result from mining, there are no enforceable drinking water quality standards to this day. So in addition, and this is a picture of White Bear Lake. You might have read about it, that the Minnesota Supreme Court said that citizens could claim, they could make the case in court that DNR had impaired White Bear Lake and the aquifer by mismanaging groundwater appropriations. And instead of building a treatment plant to take water from the Mississippi River and do it on a regional way, it was cheaper to just dig holes. And so they have about 70 permits. And in the past decade, about 25% of the water volume in White Bear Lake has diminished. And the idea that the DNR, Department of Natural Resources, is taking a casual attitude to the appropriation of water is not just in White Bear, where there's a community that doesn't want to spend enough for wastewater treatment. It is a very serious problem. It structurally affects sulfide mining, and it's also structurally affecting something that you may not have read about, but I was involved in a very tangential way. The Pineland Sands area in central northern Minnesota has very shallow soils, sandy soils, and right now it's a diverse forest ecosystem. R.D. Offutt is planning to clear cut huge areas of that forest in order to be able to plant basically a monocrop of potatoes for McDonald's French fries. And initially, some of the impacts would be loss of water, fertilizer, pesticides. It would change the entire ecosystem. Initially, the Department of Natural Resources was going to start an environmental review, but then they agreed with a company to let them do one permit at a time, rather than looking at the whole cumulative project, and they basically put a kibosh on their own plan for environmental review. And the other thing, just thinking about the value of water, DNR charges anywhere from $3.50 up to $8 for each million gallons of water appropriated. So the costs of using Minnesota's water and either bringing them from one area to another or putting them back less clean are very low. And the Freshwater Society has identified from south and northern Minnesota at least 16 areas where there is seriously depleted groundwater due to overuse, either by industry or by development or by agriculture. So now we get to sulfide mining. You get the context, in the context that this new and very toxic form of industry is trying to move into Minnesota. And the context is that Minnesota is not really prepared with a stringent science-based way of protecting the water quality from industry. And one of the reasons why sulfide mining is so dangerous is copper and nickel are bound up with sulfur. So it's a copper sulfide or a nickel sulfide ore. That's why it's called sulfide mining. And what that means is as the rock is blasted and pulverized to release the ore, that sulfur is exposed to air and water, forming sulfuric acid. And it results in what they call acid mine drainage. And also that sulfuric acid leaches toxic metals into the water. And so it has very significant, in addition to sort of the this crude resource destruction of open pit mines, which is what PolyMet has proposed, which destroy thousands of acres of wetlands and forests. There are also health effects that result from the contamination of the water, toxic metals in drinking water, and mercury contamination of fish, which I'm going to talk about a little more, and also that the runoff kills wild rice, kills aquatic life, and also kills wildlife. And so there information that this is not a study that WaterLegacy did, but that Earthworks has done, is basically every sulfide mine, 100%, that is done in a water-rich environment has polluted either surface or groundwater or both with acid mine drainage and or toxic metals. So this is a very risky kind of mining. And the issues are, in addition to water quality per se, is that there's an environmental injustice in Minnesota because of where these mines would be located. Minnesota does not have adequate regulatory control, and that this is an unsustainable form of resource use. It's not like fishing, where you could fish one year and you could then encourage more, you could take a time off, or you could help bring in some spawn if you have to and restore the resources if you. But in any case, you could fish year after year after year, generation after generation. Mining is a one-time use, and you don't get the wetlands back, you don't get the forests back. What you get back is the hole in the ground. And I mentioned environmental justice. The orange shape, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but here, the orange shape, this is this Duluth complex, which is where this copper nickel sulfide ores are primarily located, stretches from the boundary waters all the way down to Duluth. So depending on how effective the PolyMet snowplow is, there could be a great area of Minnesota that was affected by mining. And this number 5 down here that says CU, there is also a very an isolated but very highly concentrated area of nickel about 50 miles west of Duluth, and that's the Talon mine in the Tamarack area. And I'm going to talk about that because this location, if a mine were built, would affect the Mississippi River for sure, and possibly also the Kettle River and the St. Croix River. But if you look at the Duluth complex, and over here, this red polygon, that is the area where the Lake Superior Chippewa tribe or Ojibwe tribe, this was their land. And right now they're just, what's left is our very small reservations, these brown areas. And this large and important polygon is an area where tribes have treaty reserved rights as a matter of law to hunt, fish, and gather plants. And the way the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior explained it is the exercise of these treaty rights requires access to natural resources that are not contaminated. So if the PolyMet or the twin metals or future mines are built in this area, the government would be taking away reserved rights that have been there as a result of the tribe's presence for thousands of years, that our government, the federal government, promised not to interfere with. One of the largest concerns about the location of the PolyMet mine in particular is that the sulfate and the mercury released from the mine, plus the changes to wetlands, drying out and re-wetting, would be a perfect storm to increase mercury release and also the conversion of inorganic mercury into methyl mercury. Methyl mercury is the kind that bioaccumulates in the food chain. So methyl mercury in fish like a walleye or a northern that's at the top of the aquatic food chain, that methyl mercury could be a million times more concentrated than what's in the water. And that's one of the primary reasons, nearly 30,000 doctors and nurses requested a health impact assessment before the permits were approved for the PolyMet mine. And what they were told by the governor and the commissioners, probably by their legal counsel actually, is that there wasn't enough time, that it might slow down the environmental review or the permitting process. So they simply were not going to do the kind of independent health analysis that the doctors requested. And I think that this picture on the I'm showing you now on the right, this is a picture from São Marco, Brazil, where there was a huge tailings dam failure. Because one of the things that is the result of the regulatory pressure to approve PolyMet mines is that we are not learning from experience in Minnesota. We're not following the best available technology. We're not learning from failures. So for example, the PolyMet design does not have a liner underneath to contain and collect the seepage. Now, you couldn't build a landfill in Minnesota without that kind of liner. And for decades, mines have required them. But our tailings basin would not have a liner. There are also no limits, they're called effluent limits, at the end of the pipe for any of the toxic pollutions that will come out of the wastewater treatment plant. Now, wastewater treatment plants are good things, but in every case that we know of in Minnesota, there are effluent limits initially to make sure that the wastewater treatment is working and that it stays ratcheted up effectively enough to comply with water quality standards. First copper nickel mine ever in Minnesota, brand new treatment, and yet there are no limits at the end of the pipe on what comes out of the wastewater treatment. And then another really important thing is that there are different ways to build dams. A downstream dam, the weight of the dam is on the flat ground. An upstream dam, as it goes higher and higher, it actually leans on the tailings themselves. As a result, especially if it's a wet climate, upstream dams are the most likely to collapse and contaminate downstream waters. And in the last several years, even during this permitting process, there was one upstream tailings dam failure after another. First, the Mount Poly tailings dam failure, and that's in Canada in 2014. Then in São Marco, Brazil in 2015, and I have the word 385 miles because the pollution from that dam failure went down the river all the way until it hit the ocean. And there are a lot fewer than 385 miles between PolyMet and Lake Superior. And then in Brumadinho, that's another city in Brazil in 2019, there were 300 lives lost, most of them workers. And as a result of this extreme loss of life, all the industry and academic sources went back and they reanalyzed upstream dams and said, these are just not safe. It should not be done. And guess what? Our DNR did not want to look at the question of upstream dams again. And so that's one of the issues that we litigated. So if anyone ever tells you, if we need to mine someplace else, if we need to mine someplace for nickel and copper, we should do it in Minnesota. tell them nonsense. That's a myth. And sulfide mining lobbyists perpetuate the myth that in Minnesota, all of us are better than everybody else, but it's not true. Other countries have stronger regulations. There are at least 4 countries that have completely banned upstream dams, and some of them are even requiring decommissioning of the upstream dams that were built decades ago. It's a fact that our engineering controls for PolyMet are way below industry standards. I've talked to industry experts and they laugh. They say this is faith-based engineering. It's not the way. The industry has controlled waste for at least 2 or 3 decades. It's a fact that there's a continual pressure in Minnesota to deregulate, to make sulfide mining easier. For example, there's a part of the wastes in PolyMet are going to be located on wetlands. There was a rule in Minnesota saying, can't do it, can't locate industrial waste on wetlands. The legislature passed a loophole just for PolyMet. So we have to be careful. And also, even our existing less toxic taconite mines are leaking sulfide from their tailings basins, leaking sulfate into the waters and causing harm. So if we can't even control sulfate and mercury from taconite, that is not evidence that we are ready to control sulfate from copper nickel mining. Now, I want to say that PolyMet has got its permits in 2018, but they have not broken ground. And this, in my opinion, this slide is the answer. Most of the time, the courts just let the projects go on during litigation. But in this case, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency went so far away from normal procedures that the courts took notice, and all the PolyMet permits, the water permit and the permit to mine and the dam safety permits, are either stayed or they've now been reversed. And that's because our Minnesota Pollution Control Agency engaged in a secret campaign to prevent the US EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency that's supposed to do the oversight, from sending PolyMet permit comments. And the US EPA was very critical. They said that the PolyMet permit would not comply with the Clean Water Act, that it would be dangerous due to the mercury, and it would affect human health as well as aquatic life. And so the Pollution Control Agency talked with EPA and knew their comments were going to be negative. And first of all, they persuaded EPA not to send them so the public would never see them. And then they destroyed the records of the emails that were asking them not to send them, which is something that has never been found in Minnesota ever. And the reason we found that out is WaterLegacy did a total of 16 data requests, either under the federal FOIA or the State Data Practices Act, and filed 2 lawsuits. And there was also a union representative at the EPA who leaked some of the documents. And as a result of that, we've actually seen, I mean, I have a copy of the EPA's comments that they ended up having to read aloud to the Pollution Control Agency to make sure they would have at least some knowledge of how dangerous this project would be. Now, we and other environmental groups in the Fond du Lac Band appealed from the permit, and we recently in January, we got the permit reversed and remanded on a relatively narrow issue, which is, would the seepage from the project violate the Clean Water Act? We're asking the Minnesota Supreme Court to broaden our case, because we think it's really important that our courts stand up and say, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, you have to protect water from mercury pollution especially, and you also can't get away with violating the law and using irregular procedures to keep the public and the courts and the EPA comments all secret. Now, this is another piece of the action. We talked about that was the water pollution permit. There's also a federal permit, which is issued, that allows PolyMet PolyMet and Glencore to destroy wetlands. And that's also a Clean Water Act permit. And WaterLegacy has been working with the Fond du Lac Band since, I think, 2014 to try and establish, for the first time in history, that a downstream tribe, like a downstream state, has the ability to object to a federal permit that affects reservation waters. Fond du Lac has had their own water quality standards since, I think, 1998. And these standards would protect against mercury to make sure that their community doesn't suffer disproportionate health effects because they rely on fish for subsistence. And the Fond du Lac ban under the Obama administration, the EPA was working on how do we make sure that this process works? How do we give notice? Under the Trump administration, they simply did not give the Fond du Lac band even a letter notice that would start this process that allows them to assert their rights. And the Fond du Lac band, their tribal council sent several letters saying, give us notice. And finally, Fond du Lac band had to go to court and say that in federal district court, say, listen, the EPA had an obligation that was not a discretionary obligation to let us know that this project may affect our waters so we can see whether we can exercise our rights. And last year, a federal court judge in Minnesota, actually a very conservative judge, ruled that the Fond du Lac band had a claim against the EPA. And since that point, the EPA has stepped in, and the federal permit is now suspended also. And the EPA made a decision in June 2021 that the pollution from PolyMet, particularly the mercury, may affect tribal waters. And the band made its own determination, looking at all the science, in August of last year, that actually the PolyMet project will affect their reservation waters. And so the permit needs to be either stopped or completely changed because their waters are at risk. And this is the first time any tribe has exercised the right to object to a federal permit under that downstream state part of the Clean Water Act. And our next step is in May. There will be a public hearing. And so please make sure that you, at the end of the slide, I'm going to have my contact information. Members of the public will be able to speak in solidarity with the band virtually and support the protection of the reservation waters according to the Fond du Lac band's legally enforceable standards. And now the other thing, so we've got the water pollution permit that's been reversed and remanded. We've got the wetlands destruction permit at the federal level, which has been suspended. The PolyMet permit to mine has also been reversed, and a contested case hearing in front of an administrative judge has been ordered. Our initial victory, you can see the picture here with my hands up, that is the initial victory in January, was a broad victory. The chief judge of the Court of Appeals gave us a contested case hearing on basically everything that's fundamental to the design of the upstream dam and the bentonite and Glencore. The Supreme Court, which is usually, just in case you don't, you're not a lawyer, don't know lawyers, don't like lawyers, Supreme Court is often in Minnesota the place where environmental cases go to die. And in this case, this was a very unusual case because the Supreme Court actually ordered a contested case hearing on the control of acid mine drainage and reversed the PolyMet permit to mine for not having a term limit. So it wasn't a complete victory, but in terms of the authorities in Minnesota, a very important one, because whether or not acid mine drainage is controlled is a very serious risk of the PolyMet project. And now you've got a picture here. They're trying to move the goalposts. We are now in the middle of the contested case hearing, and we are working very hard with our allies to prevent DNR from the. Am I getting close to the end here in time? I'm talking fast. DNR is trying to minimize the scope of the contested case, and we expect a trial-like hearing with administrative law judge making decisions and with experts. So this is just a very quick primer on the upcoming threat of a Talon nickel mine. They have found a massive sulfide mineralized zone about 50 miles west of Duluth with nickel and cobalt and copper. And they have active mineral leases for 30,000 acres, which is about twice the size of Manhattan. So we don't know how big or small the actual mine is going to be. The primary rich zone is underground, is very deep underground, so most likely it'll be underground, and then some waste storage on the surface of the mine as well. And this area, this is a picture, the picture here I think is the St. Croix. The area they're looking at is near the St. Croix and the Kettle River, both of which are wild and scenic rivers, and also the headwaters of the Tamarack River, which all these rivers flow into the Mississippi. And this is also an area of abundant wild rice lakes, which are very important to both the Fond du Lac Band and the Mille Lacs Band. And there's even a small Sandy Lake Band right on one of the targeted lakes. And then the groundwater in this area, that whole community gets their drinking water from groundwater as well. So that's a potential thing to look at. And then we were talking a little bit about tribal rights. I guess one of the important things is that all of this mining would threaten wild rice because of the excessive release of sulfite. And a wild rice is, oops, are we trying, or do you need me to respond to something?
I think that we probably have a few more minutes and then only a couple of questions, Paula, but we would like to hear what else you have to say about this. Okay,
very quickly. Wild rice is the canary in the coal mine, and sulfite affects mercury. Are we good now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And sulfate also affects mercury release and methylation. And the whole history from 2010 until last year was struggling and working with the tribes to enforce and preserve the wild rice sulfate standard. And that involved beating back a lawsuit and organizing people for a repeal. And finally, towards the end of the last year, the EPA and the MPCA have agreed to list wild rice waters impaired for sulfate, which means both that they're recognizing the tribal rights and recognizing the legitimacy of the standard. Now, this is an upcoming issue, which is the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is looking at their drinking water quality standards. We mentioned that PFAS are right now not enforceable drinking water quality standards for groundwater. Neither are lead, nickel, or manganese. And so one of our efforts in the next couple of years is to take these very toxic chemicals that our health department says must be limited to protect safety for the brain, for reproductive and developmental health, and to protect both infants and fetuses and the elderly, that we need to start talking about how we're going to make enforceable standards for some of these very toxic chemicals. And so here we're at the very final question, which is, what do we value and how do we involve the community? And if we value clean water and protection of nature, environmental health, environmental justice, and a sustainable climate, the first thing that people can do is become informed, and then teach your friends and neighbors, both that there are threats to water and that we can't just sit back and expect the government to take care of us. We need to become involved in decision-making. And WaterLegacy has coached people now for 13 years how to participate in government decisions. When are the chances that you could send in a comment? Are there hearings like the upcoming hearing in May where we could come in and talk virtually and support the Fond du Lac Band? And how do we take direct action, show up, just even if it's just with a sign and quietly saying this is an important thing? And then finally, I think that education and reaching out to people is important, so we can tell our leaders that we're counting on them. We support them if they will protect people and nature and not polluters. And so here is waterlegacy.org to sign up. You can also, if you want to reach me, you can text or call this number or email me at paula@waterlegacy.org. And I am happy to take questions. I didn't realize how late we were getting, but whether people want to just raise their hands or whether they want to put questions in the chat box.
Could you get us back to where we can see the members and then
yes. There we go.
And then if someone, we've got probably time. This is really an important topic. I didn't want to cut you off. Maybe we've got time for 2 or 3 questions. So who has a burning question? Raise your hand.
I don't have a burning question, Carol, but I must say I admire the enthusiasm and the commitment. This is a remarkable story which is not told. I am in higher education, and I think these policies will continue being cyclical. And I know a lot of young people at the university who are very much involved in environment and feel and want to work. But it is important that there is some way there can be a communication which brings it in a language and understanding where they can act on a particular time. And so I'm not sure if these recording which you have made will be available, but there are certain slides which I could use and perhaps other could use from this to explain what's going on in Minnesota.
Well, thank you very much. And we would be happy to share these slides. And I mean, I could come and talk to a class. And Sophia Patain, you can see her right. I don't know if she's in the same position on your screen, but Sophia could also follow up individually with students, because we can't always predict it, but there are many times when young people's voices would make a huge amount of difference. And we're very happy if you put if we can get your contact information and follow up later, because I think what you're suggesting is super important.
Are there other questions?
I think Linda's got a hand up.
I can't.
Yes. Can you hear me? You can.
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, Paula, I've been following your leadership in WaterLegacy, even before WaterLegacy, when you were working on the PolyMet issue. And I thank you, and I'm so excited that you're still here and you're still working for us. You are an incredible champion. My question has to do with the Prove It First legislation. I mean, that's not the whole answer, but is that a valid and a good thing to push our legislators to pass?
You know, I think that the Prove It First legislation, and WaterLegacy is not leading that. That is Friends of the Boundary Waters, but we did help in drafting and we support what they're doing very much. And I think this is a really good example, because there are literally dozens of legislators who have signed on as co-authored, and they can't even get a hearing at the legislature. I mean, they can't even get an opportunity to speak to their colleagues in a public forum and explain why this bill is necessary. So the Prove It First legislation is part of the answer, not the whole answer, but it's a really good way to focus on the science. And it also shows how broken our process is, because even the legislators who we've elected haven't been able to get a hearing that we could all watch on video or all attend and learn about the dangers of copper nickel mining. So thank you for that question. And I think it exposes two things, both what are the solutions and what are the challenges in between now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, take maybe one more question if there is one.
Mary has her hand.
And I can't see. Okay,
Mary
I
Paddock.
can't see it.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Carol. I have a friend who would probably agree with everything that you said, Paula, but says that what Minnesota should focus on now is making PolyMet pay to do all the things that should be done, to take all the precautions. This person admits that the process of this kind of project has never been done safely before. Let Minnesota be the first one to do it, come up with the dollars to do it. Is that a viable argument?
For PolyMet, it emphatically is not, and here's a couple reasons. They already have their permits, and we don't have this opportunity to sort of say start from scratch and say how big the mine could be, where it could be located, are there any technologies? And they also chose a particularly awful place to locate. I mean, they chose a place to locate in the headwaters of the St. Louis River, which is upstream of Duluth, upstream of the reservation, the Fond du Lac Reservation, upstream of Lake Superior. And what happens in the headwaters affects what happens in all the waters beneath it. So this is not in a tiny tributary or an isolated area. So it's a very poor location. I think the other piece with the PolyMet Glencore project, it's a very lean deposit, which is a way of saying low grade. Less than 1% of whatever they blast out of the ground would end up being ore. So the profit margins are very slim. They in their own studies, they say maybe 10%. That is not a sufficient profit margin, even to use normal adequate technology, let alone take the next step to actually do something that works. And for example, with a tailings basin, normal technology, you put in liners and you put a strong foundation and it's not on wetlands and you isolate it. And right now, for the last 10 years, they've been saying do dry stack tailings and minimize, but there really is no technology available to make sure that the mine pits themselves don't leak after the mining is done. I mean, you could say that while they're mining, they have to pump continuously so that water will go in rather than coming out. But after the mine closes, nothing I've read suggests that there's a technology that could be used to make sure that polluted lake doesn't seep, or the waste rock polluted lake doesn't extrude through cracks and fissures. So I think the sentiment that you're trying to say is we do need metals. And I think the big thing that we should be pushing is to make it very costly to mine and do everything we can, including mandates, to increase the recycling of metals like copper and nickel, which can be recycled over and over again. And we, our government incentives have to go the other way. And that would also save, depending on the kind of technology, about 80 to 85% of the fossil fuel energy needed for the process. So it would be a huge climate advantage that way too.
Thank you.
I'd like to take this time to thank you, Paula, for your presentation today. It's kind of opened my eyes, and I hope opened the eyes of a number of you here. What I'd like to suggest is that maybe you could contact Christina about some, when might our club, or she could give it to the club members, and then we would have an opportunity to respond and help with this process. Does that seem all right, Paula?
I think it would be great to be in touch with people and about the upcoming hearing in May. And I think also if people have not had a chance to have their questions answered, I think Christina, if you want to call, give people my email, and we could have some, or even set up an online dialogue. I know Howard just put it in the chat that also this, even according to PolyMet's predictions, this would need treatment for 500 years. There are so many other aspects of the project that are concerning. And then once again, if there are people who have connections to students or teaching and have classes that they want us to reach out to, we'd be happy to do that as well. So I think we're sort of counting on Christina to help be, and Sophia to help be the masters of technology that keep us in touch, but I think we should do that.
Thank you so much, Paula. Let's give her a round. Yay.